for you to cleanse and so forth. And it's a beautiful picture there. So it's going to surface. Sooner or later it's going to come. And it's going to require getting it resolved. The refusal to mourn is the refusal to say goodbye to a loved one, to a place, to an opportunity, to your vitality, or whatever's been taken away. And this is how many religious people view these losses. The refusal to mourn our earlier disappointments condemns us, and it rigidifies us, as it did Lot's wife. Genuine grief is the deep sadness and weeping that expresses the acceptance of our inability to do anything about our losses. I guess it's break time, isn't it? Let me just say another word or two, and I'll stop at the next point. The worst grief is the one a person experiences personally. The worst grief is the one the person experiences personally. That's what I'm trying to say. Your grief is the worst one to you. Okay? And this is what we need to keep in mind. That, it's easy to sit and listen to someone and want to say, hey, get over it. Your problem ain't big. But it is to them. Okay? I don't care what you've been through or what the person who sat there where they're sitting 30 minutes ago was going through. To this person, their problem is their biggest issue. And, we respect them with that. Grief's hard work. Effective grief work is not done alone. And so we need to determine who they have in their life, what support system they have, and try to help them with that. Okay, so we're going to stop right here, and we'll pick up with helping others grieve their losses after the break. Okay? Okay, we're going to go ahead and start. I believe this is session number 8. And so we're going to go ahead and get this kicked off. We're going to start talking on page 22, helping others grieve their losses. The two most important and most helpful steps for us to take during the initial session with somebody would be to help normalize them and to help educate. By normalize, what we mean is to help them realize that what they're experiencing is not unusual, but it's normal. That they're not losing their mind or going crazy, and that even though they may still have some crazy symptoms and thoughts and emotions, that it's normal, they're going to be okay. Some symptoms of normal grief are distorted thinking patterns, a kind of crazy, strange, irrational thoughts, and even some fearful thoughts. They probably having feelings of despair and hopelessness, out of control or numbed emotions. Changes in sensory perceptions would be, as far as, their sight, smells, and taste go. Increased irritability, increase in talking or not talking at all, memory lags and mental short circuits, inability to concentrate, obsessive focus on the loved one, losing track of time, increase or decrease of appetite and or sexual desire, difficulty falling or staying asleep, dreams in which the deceased seems to visit the griever, nightmares in which death themes are repeated, physical illness like the flu, headaches, and other maladies, shattered beliefs about life, the world, and even God. Grief will take longer for the person to walk through than he or she expects it to. It tends to intensify at 3 months. Special dates in the 1-year anniversary are going to be peaks or high points in their grief journey, and it's definitely a process, but it is eventually going to get better, and there will be a resolution. Some necessary changes that a person needs to take include about 3 steps that can be followed for most losses. First of all is changing the relationship. They need to change their relationship with whatever they lost. If it was a person, they eventually need to come to the realization that the person is gone, that they've died, and that they are no longer married to or dating him or her. They need to recognize the change and develop new ways of relating to the deceased person. They have to learn to exist without the person the way they once learned to exist with the person. They need to say goodbye to whatever or whomever they lost. Perhaps this can be called acknowledging and understanding the lost. It's that point of acceptance that this is different. It's never going to be the way it was, and it's not ever going to, be that way again, in other words. And then the second step is moving on with life. This is where the counselee needs to move on, and this involves several steps. Some of this may come as a surprise. One step is keeping the loved one alive as a memory in a healthy and appropriate manner, and another step is forming a new identity without the person's presence in their life. It's a conscious step that we need to take and that they need to make. And so you don't want to forget someone that you love, but you want to form a new memory of them that is accepting of the fact that they're not in my life anymore, but that they do hold a special place, in my memory and in my life in that capacity. But also that my life now has a new dimension to it, and it has a future to it. And then the third thing is the balance with their memories. And the counselee needs to realize that sometimes when they lose something that has played a significant part in their lives, be it a job or a person, their memory of the thing or the person becomes distorted. With losing a person, the usual response is to recall only positive aspects. We talked about this last night, how people will kind of, get this grandiose picture of that person, and, everybody's kind of around them going, he or she was a nice person, but, you're over-exaggerating a little bit. I mean, they don't generally tell them that, but that's what they're thinking. And so this is a real common situation here. But in time, there has to be realism, thoughts and memories, both good and bad, positive and negative. The situations that we are glad occurred and those we wish hadn't, they have to come back to real life and realization that the person was a wonderful person, but they also were human. And that's important because these realistic images are the ones that need to be developed for the new relationship with the person. It will complicate future life if they don't do it, because they'll find themselves comparing that perfect, blown up, out of proportion person to new people in their lives. And nobody can stand up to that fictitious image, you see. The grieving process, this is helping people acknowledge and understand their loss, is essential to starting the grieving process. Depending on the severity of the loss, will determine how faint the memories and everything will be. Some deaths, such as death of a child or a spouse, may not ever be totally, completely settled or resolved. And this process, though, does encourage counselors to integrate the losses into their lives. In time, counselors need to overcome the shock and the denial and face the painful reality of what occurred. It means saying, yes, unfortunately, this did happen. And by facing the pain, what we mean is they're not going to postpone it, and it means they're not going to deny it anymore, and they're not going to minimize it anymore. In other words, they're not going to drag it out anymore. They're going to deal with the fact that this is real and it did happen. And you've got to do that. You've got to help your patient or your counselor come to this point, because basically they're stuck until they do. And they're not going to move forward in life. They're not going to be able to get past this until they do. So a process by which we can help grieving people to progress and experience and face a loss is, I think there are several 8 facets here. The first one is to assist in the grieving process. At some point it may help to have the counselees make a list of the effects of their loss, and this is one step in facing their pain. In addition, you can have them write each of 4 statements on a 3x5 card, or make them a card in advance, and ask them to concentrate on one statement each day on the back of the card. Have counselors outline what they think the statement means for the grief experience, their grief experience. The following statements are this: I believe my grief has a purpose and an end. And then the next one is, I will be responsible for my own grief process. The next one is, I will not be afraid to ask for help. And then finally, I will not try to rush my recovery. And then the next facet, as another step in the process of facing a loss, is to tell others about it as soon as possible. You call it by its name. I was a loss, and I am grieving. Depending on the severity of the loss, their numb reaction can be a slight down feeling or an incapacitating numbness. And you can see people, and you'll encounter people that will be so traumatized that you almost can't get them to do anything. I mean, they don't want to do anything but just lay around, you know. They're depressed, and they're just almost numb. They just almost don't seem to have any emotion, and they don't seem to want to get better. And these people need our help, and they need to be encouraged. After this lifts, usually 24 to 36 hours, the pain is faced, and the feelings surge in like the seasons of the year. There are seasons of depression, anger, calm, fear, and eventually hope. In other words, their emotions will just begin to fluctuate sometimes. If the loss involves trauma, the grief process can go on for years. When the first anniversary of 9/11 occurred, many in New York felt like a scab had been lifted, and once again there was an open, raw wound. For many people, all the television programs, the memorials, the ceremonies activated the depths of their wounds. Memorials are good because it helps people deal with and reflect on their grief and process it. On the other hand, it heightens also the emotions. You have a lot of, if you remember when just a few years back, it hasn't been that long, 3 or 4 years ago, when the Muslims wanted to go a block or two down the street, and I guess they did it, I don't know, but erect a Muslim temple. You remember that? There was a big uproar. That was very painful to the survivors and the people of New York City that our government allowed them to do that. Because to them, it was just like piercing, a hot poker in their emotional wound. Because, obviously Islam was the culprit behind that whole thing. And so these are the kind of things that even a nation needs to be sensitive of. When you're dealing with this kind of trauma. Mentioned to you last night, statistics say that when 9/11 happened, because of television coverage and the whole event, that 25% of our country was impacted with trauma as a result of that, experienced grief and traumatic symptoms over a period of time as a result of that one event. So it wasn't just the people on the streets that day. It was a quarter of our country. What are we, 350 million people? Something like that? You're talking about a lot of people suffering. So grief comes in valleys and peaks. The pain and the grief actually intensify at 3 months and then gradually subside, but it's not in a steady fashion. They go up and down. And emotions go up and down, and different things can spark it. You can be watching a television show and be perfectly fine, and then something can trigger it on that television show. Someone can break out into tears. Someone can experience depression all of a sudden. They just go from a normal state to depression. And it's because emotions are on edge. And this is a situation. Then the facet number 3 is how long will grief last in the loss of a person? Who the person was has much to do with the response. The response to any loss is directly related to the knowledge of the person who has died. It's the nature of the attachment. The intensity of grief is determined by the intensity of the attachment. The more intense the love relationship, the more severe the grief reaction. The greater the presence of the one who died to the sense of well-being and self-esteem of the counselee, the more intense the grief reaction. So we call this security of the attachment. In all relationships, there are both positive and negative feelings. Usually the positive feelings far exceed the negative feelings. However, in the case of a highly ambivalent relationship, negative feelings that coexist in almost equal proportion to the positive ones, the grief reaction will be more intense. There's also a tremendous amount of guilt associated with highly ambivalent relationships, often expressed as, did I do enough? There may also be intense anger at being left alone. The history of conflicts, as well as more recent disagreements, will be an important detriment of the grief response. There's a lot of mental processing that takes place after somebody dies. a lot of reviewing episodes and events and things that happened, things that took place in occurring months, prior to the death. We had this conflict. We said this. We did this. We should have done this. We didn't do this. I should have done this. I should have helped with this. I wish I hadn't have said that. And so, depending on how that relationship was and what interchange took place between these individuals will obviously intensify or depressurize the magnitude of the grief and help or sometimes make the grief worse. So number 4, how a person died will also say something about how the survivors grieve. Traditionally, death has been cataloged under the NASH categories, which stands for natural, accidental, suicidal, or homicidal. The accidental death of a young child may be grieved differently from the natural death of an older person. The location of the death, whether it happened close or far away, is also important and can also determine the grief response. Another factor is advance warning. Was there some advance warning, or was the death unexpected? Studies suggest that survivors of sudden deaths, especially young survivors, have more difficult time 1 or 2 years later than people with advance warning. When I was in mission school, which was in 2004, I think. Part of the training that we had to go through was we had to be in a cross-cultural small group, and I was in a cross-cultural small group with, I think there were 6 of us, and each one of us had to be from a different nation. Well, there's 60 different nations at CF&I, and so within that group, I made 2 close friends who I'm still close with today. One of them's name was Dominica Hinda, and the other guy's name was Wansik Ewan. And Dominica Hinda is from Namibia, and Wansik Ewan was from Seoul, Korea. And so, of course, you know who I am. So we developed a bond, and pretty quickly. And we decided, after a few small group meetings with the rest of our group, there were 3 others, but the 3 of us decided we wanted our families to meet, and so we decided to meet at Wansik's apartment. They had a swimming pool and a nice little picnic area and a barbecue grill. And so we all decided to meet there on a Sunday afternoon, I believe it was, and barbecue and have a nice meal together. And this was in the fall, probably about October. It was kind of not cold, but it wasn't really extremely warm either. And there was nobody out there but us. It wasn't the kind of weather that you'd really want to sit around the pool unless you were just, had a reason to, like us. So we're sitting there, and Dominica Hinda, which we called him Hinda, he 3 children, and Juan had 2 children, and Hinda's youngest child at that time was his youngest child was a little infant baby, just born, and Sammy was his middle child. Sammy was about 2 years old, and I had been holding Sammy, cute little baby, and while the guys were cooking and barbecuing, I was holding Sammy for probably 30 or 45 minutes, and finally he wanted to get down, so he was sitting between me and his dad, and we were all eating at the table, and the families were having a nice time talking and visiting, and just talking about the Lord, having a good time. And the picnic table was up on a raised area, and it had shrubberies around it, and you couldn't see anything out there very good. Well, Anna, which is Hinda's wife, had to go to Wansik and his wife's apartment to change the infant's diaper. So she walked out and went up this way. Well, Sammy kind of followed her. And we all were under the assumption that she was aware of that, and the toddler, Sammy, was going with her. Well, probably 5 minutes, maybe 10 at the most passed. And I don't even remember exactly everything about it, but I remember that Juan Sikh, who we called Juan, for some reason he had left and headed to go toward the apartment, and when he did, I heard him scream. And when I heard him scream, I stood up, and I could see over the shrubs, and I noticed him reaching in the pool, and he was pulling Sammy out of the pool, the little 2-year-old. And he grabbed him, and he ran back towards where we were. Well, I jumped up, and I jumped over the shrubs, and I think he was panicking. I think he didn't know what to do. I think he basically grabbed him, and he was just running. He didn't know what to do. And so I ran, I grabbed him and stopped him, and I took the child from him, and I put him down, and I started giving him mouth-to-mouth resuscitation and, gentle compressions. And by that time, Henda jumped up when I did. He and I were sitting at the table, and of course, he was just traumatized. He was praying, in the Spirit, and he was just totally traumatized, and he didn't know what to do. By that time, Anna has come down with the baby. Everybody's praying, and I'm trying to revive this child that has drowned in the swimming pool that we didn't know. So this goes on. Well, finally, someone looks out of an apartment window, and, someone hollers, call, 911 or something like that. I think Laurie had already called 911, but anyway, someone hollers up to her. Well, maybe 10 or 15 minutes, which seemed like days, you know how that goes. The ambulance got there, scooped him up, and they were gone. Well, to make a long story short, Sammy didn't make it. He died. So here you have this family that's 7,000 miles away from home, in ministry, training, and they got their precious child. They're, basically doing absolutely nothing wrong, everything right, and they lose their child. It's like, what do you say, and how do you explain to them? And so all we could do was embrace them and comfort them and love them. And so we're still friends to this day. Of course, we're talking about 10 years ago, But we'll watch them over the next year, how they dealt with their grief, how they progressed through the healing process. And God has done a tremendous work in their family and in their home. And, and they have been healed and recovered. Now, they still miss Sammy, obviously. But when you have a circumstance like that, that whole event is so traumatic that you don't expect to just get over something like that, instantaneously. When you lose a child, there's nothing compared to that. And God gives special grace for it and everything, but it's a very difficult situation. And but God will help you cope. And people need you to be around them and to support them and to help them. So it's a life-changing event. And it's tough. This sixth facet here, there's an assessment of how a person views and impacts the changes that they've made. And, as you work with grieving individuals, there are a number of other factors that take into consideration in order to understand their response to loss. Basically, what you're needing to do is you need to keep an eye on them. You need to watch them, see how they're progressing, make sure they're not pulling away from people, they're not pulling away from the Lord, they're not pulling away from their family, but that they are progressing and that they are learning to cope and to deal with the stress. And then number 7, some people derive benefits from grieving. A survivor might get a lot of mileage in his or her social network. In other words, some people, this is not the more common thing, but there are some people that will use grief for their benefit. In other words, they get attention, they get special treatment, and so it's not so much that the grief is genuine grief. It's just a way to get people to pay them attention. And these people have other issues that need to be addressed and dealt with. And then number 8, finally, some of the other stresses that are occurring at this time and other factors that affect grief recovery are concurrent changes and crises that arise following a death. Although some change is inevitable, there are those individuals and families that experience a high level of disruption following a death. And these can be economic problems. It can be a lot of different types of things, So, you know how that can be. For example, if you lose the breadwinner of the family, what are you going to do? How are we going to make this house payment? How are we going to feed the children? How are we going to pay for their education and things of this nature? And so these become secondary losses and issues that become very important and need to be resolved. Some defensive modes. Sometimes a person you're counseling discovers different ways of protecting themselves from the reality of pain and loss. And we need to know and understand that some of this is all normal. These symptoms are not unusual and they're not strange. Doesn't mean a person's crazy. And actually, it's partially positive because it helps to shield you a little bit. And it helps you get through the momentary crisis. If you didn't have these responses, you really might go crazy. Of course, denial. And this is one of these ways is denial. And this is when the loss is rejection, abandonment, or death. Denial is the usual defense. It's the expression, no, that's not true. It can't be true. The most serious kind of denial is denying not only the reality of what has occurred, but also the effects of the loss. Everything's blotted out of a person's mind at this time. Grieving is moving through several levels of denial. Each stage brings home the reality of the loss a bit deeper and more painfully. First, we accept it in our heads. Secondly, in our feelings. And then finally, we adjust our life's pattern to reflect the reality of what has occurred. So there's a process to getting past denial. It has to start somewhere. And then we work our way through the actual implementation of it in our lifestyle. And then there's rationalization. This is another defense against loss. It really didn't hurt that bad. There are other better men out there, or people out there. After all, I only went with him for 2 years. This is things that a woman might say if she lost a man or a boyfriend or something. Somebody loses a car. Who needs that car? Or somebody passes away and they live to be an older person, and instead of dealing with the issue of the loss, they might say, well, Grandma lived a long life and now she's better off where she is. Well, that's all true, and we're glad that it is, but you still need to be able to realize that you're going to miss her. You're going to deal with some grief, and you need to be able to see that and deal with it. These statements have one basic purpose, and that's helping us cope with pain and loss. The attempt to lessen the impact, that's what they're after. And that's what is going on. But it can't go on forever. You have to come to a point to where you stop rationalizing and what some people sometimes would call it making excuses. But it's a part of our coping mechanisms, what it is. And then idealization. This is that third defense where people use this to handle the loss. And this is when we distort the reality of idealizing what was lost. And it's when negative characteristics or aspects are overlooked. We talked about that already, but making it out to be more than what it really was. Sooner or later, we're going to have to come back to the reality and the truth of the situation. Some appropriate expectations to have in the grief process would be to assist someone in grief. You have to foremost help the counseling understand what to expect. And some sample listings of appropriate expectations. Your grief will take longer than what most people think. They need to know that. Grief will take more energy than what you would ever have thought it would. Grief is tiring. I mean, it really is. You just feel exhausted, and you hadn't done anything except grieve. But it is. Grief will involve many changes and will continually develop. It will show itself in all spheres of life. It will depend upon how you perceive the lost. You will grieve for what you have lost already and for what you have lost in the future. Your grief will entail mourning, not only for the actual person you lost, but also for the hopes, the dreams, the unfulfilled expectations you held for and with that person, and for the unmet needs because of death. Your grief will involve a wide variety of feelings and reactions, more than just the general ones often depicted with grief, such as depression and sadness. Your loss will resurrect old issues, feelings, and unresolved conflicts from the past. You may have a combination of anger and depression, such as irritability, frustration, annoyance, and tolerance. You'll feel some anger and guilt, and at least some manifestation of these emotions. You may experience grief spasms, acute upsurges of grief that occur suddenly without warning. You'll have trouble thinking about memories, organizational tasks, and intellectual processing and making decisions. You may feel like that you're going crazy at times. You may be obsessed with the death and preoccupied with the deceased. You may find yourself acting socially in ways that are different from before. You may find yourself having a number of physical reactions. And others will have unrealistic expectations about your mourning and may respond inappropriate to you. In other words, they won't understand why you're not okay. And they won't understand why you're acting the way you are, because they don't understand grief. And they don't realize what you've really been traumatically exposed to. So in some summary here, grief brings with it, depending on the combination of factors, an intense amount of emotion that will surprise you and those around you. And most of us are not prepared to deal with this. Our expectations tend to be too unrealistic, and more often than not, we receive insufficient assistance and help from our friends and from those support systems that we have around us. Helping a grieving person recover and say goodbye is our next category. And from time to time, it's beneficial to help people look closely at an emotion in order to determine its extent and describe what it feels like. Depression, what it's like when you feel depressed. Well, some people describe it as being like a slate gray afternoon. Everything is just blah. That's depression. A cold, drizzling rain, a hot, oppressively humid day, a freezing morning with a bitter wind, dull, overcast sky, a season of ankle-deep mud and slush. It all depends, these kind of things depend on how you might use adjectives to describe depression, but these are how people describe it. Right now, what type of weather forecast best describes where you are in the spiral process of dealing with your loss? Stormy conditions, partly cloudy, heavy rain, a thaw, chilly days, sunny days ahead, gentle breezes are blowing. In other words, how would you use these adjectives to depict how you feel today and where you are? Where on the scale would you place your current grief process? I've not been depressed. I am beginning to feel depressed. After you read these symptoms, it kind of pulls you down, don't it? But anyway, I am in the middle of heavy depression. I am through most of my depression. Okay? Okay, I think I'm going to go home and go to bed. Okay. Anger. Anger is another common response. When we lose things or people, we can become angry. There are many reasons for anger. Anger and even rage are common reactions to the loss of a loved one. As people think about what they have lost and how life has changed overnight, the following are some more specific reasons why people get angry. They may be angry at the person who died and has left them behind to face a lot of legal work and loneliness. I remember my mom, when my natural father died, she was 40 years old. He was 45, she was 40, and she was so mad at him for leaving her alone at 40 years old. She'd never worked a job for anybody except him. They married, she was 16 years old. All she ever wanted to be in life was a good mother, and she was. And that was her ambition in life, was just to be a good mother. She didn't want to work for nobody. She didn't want to do anything. She only finished 10 and a half years of school and had no desire. She did get her GED, but she really didn't even care if she did or not. She just, my mother wasn't then, isn't today really full of what you'd call ambition. She's just happy living. She's just a happy person, and just a very kind, sweet person and a caring, motherly person. And that was her ambition in life. She didn't want to be self-supporting at 40 years old. She didn't want to be on her own, and there she was. And I can remember her saying several times, multiple times, I am so mad at him for leaving me. Well, he didn't really plan that. You know what I'm saying? But yet she was grieving. And those were some of her feelings. They may be angry at themselves for not doing enough. They may be angry because of the change in lifestyle that's inflicted upon them, or over role changes that have been made within the family. When my mother remarried, I'm using my family situations because, that most familiar to me. When my mother remarried, she remarried a wonderful, good Christian man. I loved him. I thought he was great. Some of y'all remember him probably. His name was Paul. And Paul was a great guy. But my brother just didn't like him at all. And he never did like him until he passed away. But he was so upset with my mother for marrying Paul. And it took him so long to get over the fact that she married Paul, But it's like, deal with it, She has a right to marry who she wants to marry, but she was a young lady when my daddy died. She was only 40 years old. And she was married to Paul almost as long as she was married to our father. You know. Sometimes people will be angry because their friends and family have gone back to their normal lives and they're not thinking about their grief anymore. People will be angry because the rest of the world busies itself around them, and though nothing has happened, just like life is normal now. But you know what? Life is. People have to go back to a normal life. They have to move on. They may be angry with God. The root of the problem is not all the issues that people are upset about. The problem is they're grieving. They're hurting because they aren't yet through the process of being healed and learning to cope with this situation. And so that's the reason they're casting blame. That's the reason they're angry. They're frustrated. So whatever their reason is or their excuse is, that's the issue. With my brother, he was grieving because my brother was always a mama's boy. He lived with her till he was 30 years old. Him and his wife, Lori. And, after my dad passed away, Daryl and Lori had gotten married in November. Dad died in March. Daryl and Lori had lived with them, and after Dad passed away, they just kept on living with her, you know. And then when Paul came along, Daryl and Lori had to move out. And well, you know, you fill in the rest of the story. Amen. Okay. So anger can be positive, but it's definitely a symptom of grief. And it can be used in creative ways. And here's here's a few creative ways that anger can be used positively. A relative of an accident victim convinced the hospital chaplain staff to establish new and improved procedures for helping survivors of sudden accidental deaths. So they used it in a positive way. You've heard of MAD, Mothers Against Drunk Driving. That came from, out of crisis situations. A parent proposed that warning signs be posted at the pond where his son drowned to help reduce similar accidental deaths. A grandmother requested that parents of cancer victims be provided printed information about cancer as well as the location of support groups. An adult son who lost his elderly father organized programs for a local convalescent home. A young mother who lost her preschool-aged daughter solicited toy contributions to give to a local pediatric ward. So, if you notice, they took action. They used their anger and their frustration to produce good fruit and not to use it in a negative way, in a harmful way. If you remember the words of Jesus, he said, "Be angry and sin no more." The idea is not that anger is in itself a bad thing. Anger is simply an emotion. That's all it is. It's what you do with your anger. Yeah. Amen? Anger tells you something. It tells you that you're experiencing something, because anger is a sign or a symptom to what's happening on the inside of you. Okay? So one of the responses to loss that many of us don't want to admit is a sense of relief or liberation. Sometimes people especially people who know that someone is going to pass away, and there's kind of an anticipatory grief that's taking place. When the person finally passes, they have a sense of relief or release. And then there's a little bit of guilt that may be associated with that. But overall, they have processed through much of the grief process prior to the passing. And so when the person finally passes away, their recovery is very quick, sometimes almost instantaneous, because they've already grieved along with the dying person. And it can be a positive thing as much as possible. Anyway, we need to look out for people in grief. And also, especially watching for those that don't have a church home, those that have stopped attending church because of congregational situations or tension, those that don't speak English or Spanish, those whose loved one died while they were away from the home community, while traveling on business or vacation, anyone whose loved one was undergoing treatment in a specialty medical center in another city. These are people that are at high risk for not processing their grief well, okay? They really need to be reached out to. These are people. This could be someone who has recently relocated in a transition, people who have been accused by organized religion, oh my, who are members of highly dysfunctional families, who have been marginalized by society, who cannot be involved in church due to health reasons or disability, people with mental disorders and disabilities, young children, ex-spouses, or in-laws. Well, pretty much that covered everybody. So, we need to be watching out for people, amen? Because people are at risk for, difficulties in processing grief. So talking about crisis here, what is a crisis? When you hear this word, what pictures or words pop up into your mind? Well, probably urgent, upset, helpless, non-functional, hopeless, anxious, numb, hysterical, dangerous, out of control, perhaps all of these things. The word crisis doesn't actually appear in the Scripture, but it does contain numerous accounts of crises. There are biblical terms that reflect a crisis, such as a trial, tribulation, test, persecution, and affliction. Other terms can reflect a crisis state, such as suffering, hardship, adversity, and pain. You've got several scripture references there. The Word of God describes many in a state of crisis. Paul was one of them. Let's read this passage right here. Now Saul, still breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord, went to the high priest and asked for letters from him to the synagogues at Damascus, so that if he found any belonging to the way, both men and women, he might bring them bound to Jerusalem. And it came about that as he sojourned, he was approaching Damascus, and suddenly a light from heaven flashed around him. And he fell to the ground and heard a voice saying to him, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? And he said, Who art thou, Lord? And he said, I am Jesus whom you are persecuting. But rise and enter the city, and it shall be told you what you must do. And the men who traveled with him stood speechless, hearing the voice, but seeing no one. And Saul got up from the ground, and excuse me, and though his eyes were open, he could see nothing, and leading him by the hand, they brought him into Damascus. And he was 3 days without sight, and neither ate nor drank. Now, you're talking about a traumatic event. That was a traumatic event right now. Light comes from heaven. Jesus appears out of nowhere. Spirit of God knocks him off his donkey, amen. Okay, y'all need to read the story and think about it. You'll get what I'm saying here. Okay, this is one of the most famous accounts of a sudden religious conversion, and frequently such a conversion can precipitate a crisis. It's an excellent example depicting some of the characteristics of crisis. This experience affected Paul in many ways. First of all, it affected him physically. He couldn't see, and he had to be led by the hand into the city. Now, the guy struck blind, okay? Not just momentarily from the bright light. This was a lingering effect. Secondly, he was changed spiritually. He becomes a believer and reverses his whole pattern of responding to Christians. Okay? So his whole occupation, his whole theology, his whole viewpoint on Christianity and Judaism and everything is reversed instantaneously. Okay? Thirdly, he's affected mentally and emotionally, for he did not eat or drink for 3 days. I don't think he called a fast. I think the dude was in shock. Okay? His conversion caused a crisis or a turning point, and in his case for the better. We have talked about the word crisis, but to minister to others properly, we need to become expert in understanding its meaning. Webster, therefore, defines crisis as a crucial time and a turning point in the course of anything. This term is often used for a person's internal reaction to an external hazard. It is an upset in a person's baseline level of functioning. It is a disruption of the balance of his or her life. Anxiety, depression, and tension increase. A crisis usually involves a temporary loss of coping abilities, And the assumption is that the emotional dysfunction is reversible. If a person effectively copes with the threat, he or she then returns to prior levels of functioning. The Chinese character for crisis is made up of two symbols, one for despair and the other for opportunity. The doctors talk about a crisis. When doctors talk about a crisis, they're talking about the moment in the course of a disease when a change for the worse or better occurs. When some counselors talk about a marital crisis, they are talking about turning points when the marriage can go either direction. It can possibly move toward growth, enrichment, and improvement, or it can move toward dissatisfaction, pain, and in some cases, dissolution. So here's some causes of crisis. When people are thrown off balance by an ensuing event, they are then experiencing a crisis. The term is frequently misused. It's applied incorrectly to even everyday annoyances. The terms stress and crisis are used interchangeably, but incorrectly. Keep in mind that underlying a crisis is a loss of some kind. Therefore, crisis and loss go hand in hand. But there is a difference between a crisis and trauma, which we're going to discuss later. So a crisis can be the result of one or more factors. It can be a problem that is too great or overwhelming, such as the death of a child, or it can be a problem that to most people is not serious, but for a given person has the special significance. Because of this, it becomes overwhelming for the individual. It can also be a problem that comes at a time of special vulnerability or when the person is unprepared for it. Ordinarily, people handle a stopped-up sink with no problem. But if it happens when they're sick, they may feel overwhelmed. If it occurs when the person's normal coping mechanisms are not functioning well, and when the person does not have support from others whom he or she needs, often a crisis is just one step away from trauma. Crises are not always bad. Rather, they represent a pivotal point in a person's life. Therefore, it can bring opportunity as well as danger. As people search for their methods of coping, they may choose paths of destruction, but they may also discover new and better methods than they previously had available. So, we read a lot right there, but it's necessary because I don't want to miss anything. This is important. And there are four common elements of what a crisis is about. There's the hazard event, there's the vulnerable state, the precipitating factor, and there's the state of active crisis. A hazard event is an occurrence that starts a chain reaction of events that culminates in a crisis. It's pretty self-explanatory, really. But to give you an example here of the young woman who prepared 7 years for her career now discovers she's pregnant. She's a college senior who, in order to be selected by the pros, devotes himself to football during school, now shatters an ankle while hiking. A widower raising 5 pre-adolescent children loses his job in a very specialized profession. All of these people have much in common, and it's important for the person in the crisis and for their helpers or counselors to identify the precipitating events. Jane Crisp states that crisis intervention is a process used to interrupt and or positively impact a person's immediate crisis reactions, sometimes called emotional first aid. Crisis intervention involves the use of verbal and nonverbal communication to encourage, empower, and build confidence in those who experience a crisis. Okay? The vulnerable state, this person must be vulnerable for the crisis to occur. Even going without sleep for 2 nights can make a person vulnerable in a situation that he or she would usually handle without difficulty. Being ill or depressed also lowers coping mechanisms. You don't want to let yourself get overloaded. If you stress yourself out or allow yourself to be stressed too much, you're going to become vulnerable to crisis. And so you also need to let your people that you're counseling know this, that it's important for people to always remember. People who say, well, I've got so much demand on me, I don't have time for anything. Remind them, you're in charge of your schedule. Remind them that you have to make choices